and everything else was horrible. My autism was like, no, there's nothing. So I'm going to go back a couple of paragraphs. That's about it. Because I think we're talking about CD&W and FIDES, which are two instruments of the French imperialist colonial entities. So let's go back. All right, let's go back. Thank you for coming in again. I'm sorry about that, everybody. The French also had their counterpart to CD&W in the form of FIDES. I don't know if I should say FIDES or FIDES. Set up in 1946. From the earliest days of colonial expansion, there were two kinds of explanations of motives coming out of the metropoles. One was very frank and appealed to the various chambers of commerce in European towns. It said simply that Europeans were in the colonial game because it was damned profitable, and that was that. However, there were other elements who thought it necessary to peddle a line about welfare of the, quote, uncivilized natives, end quote. This was a continuation of the earlier justification of slavery on the grounds that it carried the heathen Africans to Christian lands. Also, colonialism came under heavy criticisms during the last decades. More deliberate efforts were made to whitewash it. Both CD&W and FIDES striving to were part of the public relations propaganda of colonialism, striving to mask their and deny this viciousness. Above all, both FIDES and CD&W were born of post-war conditions in Europe, at the time when Western European capitalist nations were desperately falling back on the colonies to save them vis-a-vis socialism and even from the competition of the United States. Mr. Bevan, a noted labor leader turned traitor to his class and spokesman of British capitalism, made the observation that, quote, the other two world powers, the United States and Soviet Russia, have tremendous resources. If Western Europe is to achieve its balance of payment and to get the world equilibrium, it is essential that African resources should be developed and made available, end quote. Any close study of the operations of the CD&W and FIDES reveals clearly that they had nothing to do with African development, but a greater deal to do with the welfare of the capitalist Europe. The so-called development funds of Africa went almost exclusively into the building of economic infrastructures and into a provision of certain social services. Of the SD&W grants between 1946 and 1956, less than 1% was allocated to industries. In the case of FIDES, from 1949 to 1953, the corresponding figures was less than 0.5%. Agriculture fared very little better, although that was, of course, the principal activity in which Africans were engaged. The colonial administration of Nigeria set up the 10-year plan with hopes of borrowing heavily from CD&W. In that plan, the sum of it's £1,824,000,000 was voted for agriculture out of the total of £53 million. Oh, okay, wait. Yeah, it's 1,000. Well, it says 1,824 million pounds. Most of that agriculture grant was to be consumed by constructing an agricultural school and for providing salaries for British, quote, experts. Other British colonies drew up 10-year plans which had the same deficiencies as the Nigerian one. And indeed, they were all apologies for the true economic plans being nothing else but a series of disjointed projects drawn by different government departments as extension to their then existing activities. Thus, the plans could not be expected to break any new ground, and they completely ignored developmental features such as stimulating internal and intra-African trade. The high proportion of the development, quote unquote, funds went into the colonies in the form of loans or ports, railways, electric power plants, waterworks, engineering workshops, and warehouses, which were necessary for more efficient exploitation in the long run. In the short run, such construction works provided outlets for European steel, concrete, electrical machinery, and railroad rolling stocks. 1/5 of FIDES funds were spent on prestigious public work in Dakar, which suited French industry and employed large numbers of expatriates. Even the schools built under FIDES funds were unnecessary high cost per unit because they had to be the requisite standard too, providing jobs outlets for white expatriates. Incidentally, loans were tied, quote unquote, in such a way that the money had to be spent on buying material manufacturers in the relevant metropoles. The quote unquote development funds were raised on the European money market by the governments concerned. And in effect, the national metropolitan governments were providing their own bankers and financiers with guaranteed profitable outlets for their capital. In 1956, the French government started a scheme which was a blatant form of promoting their own private capitalists while paying lip service to African development and welfare. The scheme involved the creation of an institution such as SDOM, Financial Societies of the Development of Overseas Territories. SDOM was nothing but an association of private capitalist interests, primarily in the oil of North Africa, and with large government subventions to achieve their goals. There were many telltale signs which unmasked the CD&W hoax in the eyes of careful and concerned observers. The colonial secretary set up a council to help him to allocation of grants, and it was dominated by really powerful members of the British bourgeoisie, including directors of Barclay Bank. Since the CD&W funds were inadequate even for the hopeless 10-year plans of the colonies, the British government then encouraged the colonial administration to borrow the rest of their finances on the open money market. That was another way of ensuring that African labor and resources dispatched surplus to greedy European money changers. Barclay Bank was one of the first to seize the opportunity of lending the colonial regimes to supplement the CD&W grants. The bank set up a special overseas department corporation to quote unquote assist Africa. The chairman of the banks assuring all that quote unquote the development of the colonial empire and the well-being of the inhabitants is a matter that concerns every citizen of Britain, end quote. That was the language of public relations, which fitted in very well with the sordid hypocrisy practiced by white men ever since they started killing and enslaving in the name of civilization and Christianity. As part of the hypocrisy of colonialism, it became fashionable to speak of how Europe brought Africa into the 20th century. This assertion has implications in the socioeconomic and political spheres, and it can be shown to be false, not in some, but in all respects. So often, hold on a second, I have someone from Palestine. So often it is said that colonialism modernized Africa by introducing the dynamic features of capitalism, such as private property in land, private ownership of the means of other means of production, and money relations. Here is an essential. 2. Distinguishing between capitalist elements and capitalism as a total social system. Colonialism introduced some elements of capitalism into Africa. In general terms, where communalism came into contact with the money economy, the latter imposed itself. Cash crop farming and wage labor led away from the extending family as the basic of production and distribution. One South African saying put forward that, quote, "The white man has no kin. His kin is money," end quote. That is a profound revelation of the difference between capitalism and pre-capitalist societies. And when capitalism came into contact with the still largely communal African society, it introduced money relations at the expense of kinship ties. However, colonialism did not transform Africa into a capitalist society comparable to the metropoles. Had it done that, one might have complained of the brutalities and inequalities of capitalism, but it could not then have been said that colonialism failed to advance Africa along the path of human historical development. Capitalism as a system within the metropoles or epic centers had two dominant classes. Firstly, the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, who owned the factories, the banks, and major means of producing and distributing wealth. And secondly, the workers, or the proletariat, who worked in the factories of the said bourgeoisie. Colonialism did not create a capital owning and factory owning class among Africans or even inside Africa, nor did it create the urbanized proletariat of any significance, particularly outside South Africa. In other words, capitalism in the form of colonialism failed to perform in Africa the task which it had performed in Europe in changing social relations and liberating the forces of production. It is fairly obvious that capitalists do not set out to create other capitalists who would be rival. On the contrary, the tendency of capitalism in Europe from the very beginning was one of competition, elimination, and monopoly. Therefore, when the imperialist stage was reached, the metropolitan capitalists had no intentions of allowing rivals to arise in the dependencies. However, in spite of what the metropoles wanted, some local capitalists did emerge in Asia and Latin America. Africa is a significant exception to the sense that, compared with other colonized people, far fewer Africans had access even to the middle rung of the bourgeoisie ladder in terms of capital for investment. Part of the explanation for the lack of African capitalists in Africa lies in a revival of minority groups. Arrival of minority groups who had no local family ties, which could stand in the way of the ruthless primary accumulation which capitalism requires. The Lebanese, the Syrian, the Greek, this is from India, an Indian businessman who rose from the ranks of petty traders to become minor and sometimes substantial capitalists. Names like Ree and Leventis were well known in West Africa, just as names like Madhavinan and Veseram became well known as capitalists in East Africa. There were clashes between the middlemen and the European colonialists, but the latter much preferred to encourage the minorities rather than to see Africans build themselves up. For instance, In West Africa, the businessmen from Sierra Leone were discouraged both in their own colony and in other British professions where they chose to settle. In East Africa, there was hope among Ugandans, in particular that they might acquire cotton gins and perform some capitalist functions connected with cotton growing and other activities. However, when the 1920s, a development commission was appointed to promote commerce and industry in favor firstly Europeans and then Indians. Africans were prohibited by legislation from owning guns. Taking Africa as a whole, the few African businessmen who were allowed to emerge were at the bottom of the ladder and could not be considered as quote-unquote capitalists in the truer sense. They did not own sufficient capital to invest in large-scale farming, trading, mining, or industry. They were dependent both on European-owned capital and on the local capital of minority groups. That European capitalism should have failed to create African capitalists is perhaps not so striking as its inability to create the working class and to diffuse industrial skill throughout Africa. By its very nature, colonialism was prejudiced against the establishment of industry in Africa, outside of agriculture and the extractive spheres of mining and timber felling. Whenever internal forces seemed to push in the direction of African industrialization, they were deliberately blocked by the colonial governments acting on behalf of the metropolitan industrialists. Groundnut oil mills were set up in Senegal in 1927 and began export to France. They were soon placed under restriction because of protests of oil millers in France. Similarly, in Nigeria, the oil mills set up by Lebanese were discouraged. The oil was still sent to Europe as raw materials for industry. But European industrialists did not then welcome even the simple stage of processing groundnuts into oil on African soil. Many irrational contradictions arose through colonial Africa as a result of the non-industrialization policy. Sudanese and Ugandans grew cotton, but imported manufactured cotton goods. Ivory Coast grew cocoa and imported tinned cocoa and chocolate. The tiny working class of colonial Africa covered jobs such as agricultural labor and domestic service. Most of it was unskilled, in contrast to the accumulating skills of capitalism proper. When it came to projects requiring technical expertise, Europeans did the supervision, standing around in their helmets and white shorts. Of course, in 1885, Africans did not have a technical know-how which had evolved in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. That difference was itself partly due to the kind of relations between Africa and Europe in the pre-colonial period. What is more significant, however, is the incredibly small number of Africans who were able to acquire, quote, modern skills during the colonial period. In a few places, such as South Africa and Rhodesia, this was due to significant racial discrimination in employment, so as to keep the best jobs for whites. Yet, even in the absence of whites, lack the skills among Africans was the integral part of that capitalist impact on the continent. It has already been illustrated how the presence of industry in Europe fostered and multiplied scientific techniques. The reverse side of the coin was present in Africa. No industry meant no generation of skills. Even in the mining industry, it was arranged that most valuable labor should be done outside Africa. It is sometimes forgotten that it is labor which adds value to commodities through the transformation of natural products. For instance, although gem diamonds have a value far above the practical usefulness. The value is not simply a question of their being rare. Work had to be done to locate the diamonds. That is the skill task of geologists, and the geologists were, of course, Europeans. Work had to be done to dig the diamonds out, which involves mainly physical labor. Only in that phase were Africans from South Africa, Namibia, Angola, Tanganyika, and Sierra Leone brought into the picture. Subsequently, work had to be done in cutting and polishing the diamonds. A small portion of this was performed by whites in South Africa, and most of it by whites in Brussels and London. And it was on the desk of the skilled cutter that the rough diamond became a gem and soared in value. No Africans were allowed to come near that kind of technique in the colonial period. Much of the dynamism of capitalism laid in the way that growth created more opportunities for further growth. Major industries had byproducts. They stimulated local raw material usage and expanded transport and building industries as was seen in the case of Unilever. In the words of the professional economist, those were the beneficials, quote, the backward and the forward linkages, end quote. Given that industry using African raw materials were located outside Africa, then there could be no beneficial backward or forward linkage inside Africa. After the Second World War, Guinea began to export bauxite in the hands of the French and the American capitalists. The bauxite became aluminum. In the metropoles, it went into the making of refractory materials, electrical conductors, cigarette foil, kitchen utensil, glass, jewel earrings, abrasive, lightweight structures, and aircrafts. Guinean bauxite stimulated European shipping and North American hydroelectric power. In Guinea, the colonial bauxite mining left holes in the ground. With regards to gold, the financial implications in Europe were enormous. The African gold played its part in the development of the monetary system of the industries and agriculture in the metropoles. But like bauxite and other minerals, gold is an inexhaustible resource. Once it is taken out of the country's soil, that is an absolute loss that cannot be replaced. That simple fact is often obscured so long as production continues in South Africa, but it is dramatically brought to the attention that when the minerals have actually disappeared during the colonial epoch. For instance, in the south of Tanganyika, the British mined gold as fast as they could from 1933 onwards at a place called Chanouye. By 1953, they had gobbled it all up and exported it abroad. By the end of the colonial period, Chunyan was one of the most backward spots of the whole of Tanganyika, which was itself known as the poor Cinderella of East Africa. If that was modernization and given the price paid of exploitation and oppression, then Africans would have been better off in the bush. Industrialization does not only mean factories. Agriculture itself has been industrialized in capitalist and socialist countries by the intensive application of scientific principles to irrigation, fertilizers, tools, crop selection, stock breeding. The most decisive failures of colonialism in Africa was its failures to change the technology of agriculture production. Most convincing evidence as to the superficiality of the talk about colonialism having, quote, modernized, end quote, Africa is the fact that the vast majority of Africans went into colonialism with a hoe and came out with a hoe. Some capitalist plantations introduced agriculture machinery, and the odd tractor found its way into the hands of African farmers. But the hoe remained the overwhelmingly dominant agricultural implement. Capitalism could revolutionize agriculture in Europe, but it could not do the same for Africa. In some districts, capitalism brought about technological backwardness in agriculture. On the reserves of southern Africa, far too many Africans were crowded into inadequate land and were forced to engage in intensive farming, using techniques that were suitable only to shifting cultivation. In practice, that was a form of technical retrogression because the land yielded less and less and became destroyed in the process. Wherever Africans were hampered in their use of their ancestral lands and on the wide-ranging shifting basis, the same negative effect was to be found. Besides, some of the new cash crops like groundnuts and cotton were very demanding on the soil in the countries like Senegal, Niger, and Chad, which were already on the edge of the desert. And steady cultivation led to soil impoverishment and encroachment of the desert. Wow. Look back here real quick. Is there someone else in that thing? No. I'm looking back just real quick.
يا عمو هدية ساعدني قف.
Oh my gosh.
بليز الله يوفقك يا عمو هدية. وانا قال شارك شيء بليز يا عمو هدية.
Alright, everything's good. Okay, good. Racist notions are also deep-rooted within capitalist societies, that the failure of African agriculture to advance was to put down to the inherited inferiority of the African. It would be much truer to say that it was due to the white intruders although the basic explanation is to be found not in the personal ill and will of the colonialists or in their racial origins, but rather in the organized viciousness of the capitalist/colonialist system. Failure to improve agriculture tools and methods on the behalf of African peasants was not a matter of a bad decision by colonial policymakers. It was an inescapable feature of colonialism as a whole, based on the understanding that the international division of labor aimed at skills in the metropoles and low-level manpower in the dependencies. It was also the result of the considerable use of force, including taxation in African labor relations. People can be forced to perform simple manual labor, but very little else. This was proven when Africans were used as slaves in West Indies and in America. Slaves damaged tools and carried out sabotage, which could only be controlled by extra supervision and by keeping tools and productive processes very elementary. Slave labor was unsuitable for carrying out industrial activities, so that in the United States, the North went to war in 1861 to end slavery in the South so as to spread true capitalist relations throughout the land. Following the same line of argument, it becomes clear why the various forms of forced agricultural labor in Africa had to be kept quite simple, which in turn meant small earnings. Capitalists under colonialism did not pay enough for an African to maintain himself and family. It can readily be realized by reflecting on the amount of money earned by African peasants from cash crops. The sale of produce by the African cash crop farmer rarely brought in 10 pounds per year, and often it was less than half that amount. Out of that, a peasant had to pay for tools, seeds, and transport, and he had to repay the loan to the middleman before he could call the remainder of his own. Peasants producing coffee and cocoa and collecting palm produce tended to earn more than those dealing with cotton and groundnuts. But even the ordinary Aquinpin cocoa farmer or Chaga coffee farmer never handled money in quantity sufficient to feed, clothe, and shelter his family. Instead, subsistence farming of yams and bananas continued to be supplemented. That was how the peasants managed to eat. And the few shillings earned went to paying taxes and to buy the increasing number of things which could not be obtained without money in the middlemen's shops. Salt, cloth, paraffin. If he was extremely lucky, he would have access to zinc sheets, bicycles, radios, and sewing machines, and would be able to pay for school fees. It must be made quite clear that those in the last categories are extremely few. One reason why the African peasant got so little for his agriculture crops was that his labor was unskilled. That was not the whole explanation, but it is true that the products such as cotton jumped in value during the time it went through the sophisticated processes of manufacture in Europe. Karl Marx, in clarifying how capitalists appropriated parts of the surplus of each worker, used the example of cotton. He explained that the value of the manufactured cotton, including the value of the labor that went into growing the raw cotton, plus part of the value of the labor that made the spindles, plus the labor that went into actual manufacture. From an African viewpoint, the first conclusion to be drawn is that the peasant working on African soil was being exploited by the industrialists who used African raw material in Europe or America. Secondly, it is necessary to realize that African contribution of unskilled labor was valued far less than the European contribution of skilled labor. It has been observed that 1 hour of work of a cotton peasant in Chad was equivalent to less than 1 centimeter of cotton cloth, and he needed to work 50 days to earn what was needed to buy 3 meters of cloth made from his own cotton in France. Yet the French textile workers, using modern spindles, ran off 3 meters of cloth in a matter of minutes. Assuming that the Frenchman was not closer to God, who made the whole world in 6 days, was rested on the 7th, then there must be a factor in the capitalist colonialist system which permitted the great disparity in the relative value of labor in Chad and France. In the first place, the Chad peasant was defrauded through trade so that he sold cheap and bought dear, and therefore received a minute proportion of the value that he created with his labor. This was possible not because of mysterious quote-unquote market forces, as bourgeois economists would like us to believe, but because of political power being vested entirely in the hands of the colonialists. It was a consequence of the monopolistic domination, both economically and politically. Secondly, the quantity of time spent by the Chad peasant was longer because colonialism did not permit him to acquire the tools to shorten the hours required to produce a given quantity of raw cotton. Kind of messed up, everybody, huh? Hold on a second. To a certain extent, it would have been in the interest of the colonial powers to have had better agricultural techniques in Africa, leading to the increased volumes of quantity of of production. All colonial regimes sponsored some scientific research into tropical agriculture. However, the research was almost entirely devoted to cash crops. It was limited in scope, and it was more easily adaptable by plantations than by African peasants who had no capital. The pitiable amount devoted to agriculture improvement in Africa during the colonial period contrasts sharply with the increasingly huge sums that were devoted to research in Europe over the same period, with enormous benefits to both industry and agriculture in the metropoles. Side by side with the ill-founded claims about socioeconomic modernization went the claims by colonial apologists that European rule brought political uplift and emancipation. On the one long-standing arguments in this connection, that is, Africa was in chaos in the 19th century, and that quote-unquote tribes like the Ngana and the Yo and the Samora Sofi were killing left and right and center. Consequently, Africa was saved by Livingston and Stanley. For the most part, such wild statements have no place in the works of the present generations of European scholars of Africa, since they were known to have no resemblance to reality. However, some writers still preach that, quote, the Bantu could be saved from the wasting struggles and from their general economic and technical backwardness only by the imposition of stable European governments, end quote. Disgusting. Another supposed credit of the colonialists is that they developed nationalism in Africa. That is a superficial and mischievous claim, which entirely ignores the numerous states in Africa that the eve of colonization and the direction of their evolution. Nationalism is a certain form of unity which grows out of historical experiences. It is a sense of oneness that emerges from social groups trying to control their environment and to defend their gains against competing groups. The nation state also imposes order and maintains stability within its own boundaries, usually on behalf of a given class. All those characteristics were present in the 19th century. African states, some of which were much larger than the colonies arbitrarily defined by Europeans. It is true that the present African nationalism took the particular form in adopting the boundaries carved by the imperialist. That was an inevitable consequence of the fact that the struggles to regain African independency was a condition by the administrative framework of the given colonies. But it would showcase ignorance of the African past to say that colonialism modernized Africa politically through nation states, especially when the implication is that such a level of political organization and stability would otherwise have been impossible. One colonialist proposition that was at least on the air of plausibility is that capitalism and colonial rule meant greater individual freedoms for many Africans. Young men earning wages for individual farming or cash crop became independent for the corporate demands of their families. It is debatable sorry. It is debatable to what extent that was a worthwhile phenomenon, but it could be said to be somewhat comparable to a way in which capitalism freed the individual in Europe from the restrictions of feudal society, from such bonds as those imposed by morally self-righteous people. Nevertheless, when any given African did break from what were proving to be erroneous extended family obligations, that what freedom did he acquire? His choice of alternatives was narrowly dictated by the colonialists, and he was only, quote, free, end quote, to participate in the money economy in the European-oriented cultural sectors at the very lowest and most uncreative levels. There is a mere sympathetic school of historians of Africa who contended that to see colonialism as a complete negative is to underrate the initiative of Africans. Africans, they say, moved boldly into the labor market, in cash crop farming, into commerce, in some instances, into educational fields, and into the churches. Yet those were simply responses, albeit vigorous ones, to the options laid open by the colonialists. True historical initiatives by the whole people or by individual requires that they have the power to decide on the direction in which they want to move. The latter aspects had to await the decades of the 1960s. Within any social systems, the oppressed find some room to maneuver through their own. For instance, under the slave regime of America and the West Indies, Africans found ways of means to gaining small advantages. They would flatter and, quote, con the slave masters, who were so arrogant and bigoted that they were readily fooled. Similarly, under colonialism, many Africans played the game of secure what they could. Africans in positions like proprietors, police, and court officials often had their way over the ruling Europeans. However, that should not be mistaken for power or political participation, or the exercise of individual freedom. Under slavery, power lay in the hands of the slave masters. Under colonialism, power lays in the hands of the colonialist. The loss of power for the various African states meant the reduction in freedom in every individual. Colonialism was a negation of freedom from the viewpoint of the colonized. Even the quantitative terms in it could not possibly bring modern political liberation to Africans comparable to the little that had been achieved by capitalism as an improvement of feudalism. In its political aspects, capitalism in the metropoles included constitutions, parliaments, freedom of press. All those things were limited in their application to the European working class, but they had existed in some form or fashion in the metropoles ever since the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. But Jules Ferry, a former French colonial minister, explains that the French Revolution was not fought on the behalf of black people of Africa. Bourgeoisie liberty, equality, and fraternity was not for colonial subjects. Africans had to make do with bayonet, riot acts, and gunboats. Interesting. So the slave masters move into the colonial masters. Interesting. That's an interesting transition that he made right there. I know it's obvious, but still, it was like, huh, that helped me. That helped my brain a little bit more. That helped my brain. All right. Next section. Negative characteristics of social, political, and economic consequences. Let's see how far this has to go. Let's see if I can make it to the next thing, because I think I have one more I think this might be I might have one more chapter after this. Ooh, this is a long one. All right, let's go. Here we go. Let's see where we get. The argument so far has been aimed at showing that benefits from colonialism were small and that they were not gifts from the colonialists, but rather fruits of African labor and resources for the most part. Indeed, what was called, quote, the development of Africa, end quote, by the colonialists was a cynical, shorthanded expression of, quote, the intensification of colonial exploitation in Africa to develop capitalist Europe, end quote. The analysis has gone beyond that to demonstrate that numerous false claims are made purporting to show that Europe developed Africa in the sense of bringing about social order, nationalism, economic modernization. However, all of that would still not permit the conclusion that colonialism had a negative impact on Africa's development. In offering a view of colonialism was negative, the aim is to draw attention to the way that previous African developments were blunted, halted, and turned back. In place of that interruption and blockade, nothing of compensatory value was introduced. The colonization of Africa lasted for just over 70 years in most parts of the continent. That is an extremely short period within the context of universal historical development. Yet, it was precisely in those years that in other parts of the world, the rate of change was greater than ever before. As has been illustrated, capitalist countries revolutionized their technology to enter the nuclear age. Meanwhile, socialism was inaugurated. I'm going to make sure that's an inaugurated. Let me make sure. I'm going to make sure this is the right word. Oh, still on Lennon. INAUGURAT. I think it's inaugurated. Yeah, it's inaugurated. I was right. Inaugurated. Lift semi-feudal, semi-capitalist Russia to the level of sustained economic growth, higher than that ever experienced in a capitalist country. Socialism did the same in China and North Korea. Guaranteed that. Let me reread this. Let me go back. Where's the beginning? As has been illustrated, capitalist countries revolutionized their technology to enter the nuclear age. Meanwhile, socialism was inaugurated, lifting semi-feudal, semi-capitalist Russia to the level of sustained economic growth, higher than that ever experienced in a capitalist country. Socialism did the same in China and North Korea, guaranteeing the well-being of and independence of the state, as well as recognizing the internal social arrangements in a far more just manner than ever before. It is against those decisive changes that events in Africa have to be measured. To mark time, or even to move slowly while others leap ahead, is virtually equivalent to going backward. Certainly in relative terms, Africa's position vis-a-vis its colonizers became more disadvantageous in the political, economic, and military spheres. The decisiveness of the short period of colonialism and its negative consequences for Africa sprang mainly from the fuel that Africa lost power. Power is an ultimate determinant in human society, being basic to the relations within any group and between groups. It implies the ability to defend one's interests and, if necessary, to impose one's will by any means available. In relations between peoples, the question of power determines maneuverability and bargaining. the extent to which one people respect the interests of another, and eventually the extent to which a people survive as a physical and cultural entity. When one society finds itself forced to relinquish power entirely to another society, that in itself is a form of underdevelopment. During the centuries of pre-colonial trade, some control over social, political, and economic life was retained in Africa, in spite of the disadvantages commerce with Europeans. That little control over internal matters disappeared under colonialism. Colonialism went much further than trade. It meant a tendency towards direct appropriation by Europeans of the social institutions within Africa. Africa ceased to set indigenous culture goals and standards and lost full command of training young members of society. Those were undoubtedly major steps backwards. The Tunisian Albert Memimi puts forward the following proposition: the most serious blow suffered by the colonized is being removed from history and from community. Colonization usurps any free role in either way, war or peace. Every discussion contributing to his destiny and that of the world, and all cultural and social responsibility. Sweeping as that statement may initially appear, it is entirely true. The removal from history follows logically from the loss of power which colonialism represented. The power to act independently is the guarantee to participate actively and consciously in history. To be colonized is to be removed from history, except in the most passive sense. A striking illustration of the fact that colonial Africa was a passive subject is seen in its attractions for white anthropologists who came to study, quote, primitive society, end quote. Look, that's horrible. Who's in here? Colonialism determined that Africans were no inert markers of history than their beetles, subject to be looked at under a microscope and examined for unusual features. The negative impact of colonialism in political terms was quite dramatic. Overnight, Africa, political state, lost their power, independency, and meaning, irrespective of whether they were big empires or small. Sorry, I just lost where I was at. Small polities. Certain traditional rulers were kept in office, and formal structures of some kingdoms were partially retained, but the substance of political life was quite different. Political power was passed into the hands of foreign overlords. Of course, numerous African states in previous centuries had passed through this cycle of growth and decline, but colonial rule was different. So long as it lasted, not a single African state could flourish. To be specific, it must be noted that colonialism crushed by force and surviving feudal states in North Africa, that the French wiped out the large Muslim states of Western Sudan, and as well as Dahomey and Kingdom in Madagascar, that the British eliminated Egypt and Mahadist, Sudan, Ashanti, Benin, the Yoruba Kingdom, Swaziland, Metabelaland, and Lozai, and the East African Lake Kingdoms as great states. It should further be noted that the multiplicity of smaller and growing states were removed from the face of Africa by the Belgians, Portuguese, British, French, German, Spaniards, and Italians. Finally, those that appeared to survive were nothing but puppet creations. For instance, the Sultan of Morocco retained nominal existence under colonial rule, which started in 1912, and the same applied to Bey of Tunis. But Morocco and Tunisia were just as much under the power of French colonial administrators as neighboring Algeria. They were feudal rulers were removed altogether. Sometimes the African rulers who were chosen to serve as agents of foreign colonial rule were quite obviously nothing but puppets. The French and the Portuguese were in the habit of choosing their own African quote-unquote chiefs. The British went to Iboland and invented, quote, warrant chiefs, end quote. And all of the colonial powers found it convenient to create, quote, superior or permanent rulers. Very often the local population despised such colonial stooges. They were traditional rulers such as the Sultan of Sokoto and Kabaka and Baganda and the Ashantians and the Shanti, who retained a great deal of prestige in the eyes of the Africans, but they had no power to act outside of the narrow boundaries laid down by the colonialism. Least they find themselves in the Seychelles Islands as, quote, guests of His Majesty's government, end quote. One can go so far as to say that colonial rule meant the effective eradication of African political power throughout the continent, since Liberia and Ethiopia could no longer function as independent states within the context of continent-wide colonialism. Liberia, in particular, had to bow before foreign political, economic, and military presence in the way that no genuine independent state could have accepted. And although Ethiopia held firm until 1936, most European capitalist nations were not inclined to treat Ethiopia as a sovereign state, primarily because it was African, and Africans were supposed to be colonial subjects. The pattern of arrest of African political development has some features which can only be appreciated after careful scrutiny and the takeaway of the blinkers which the colonizers put on the eyes of their subject. An interesting case in the point is that of women's rule in society. Until today, capitalist societies has failed to resolve the inequalities between man and woman, which was entrenched in all modes of productions prior to socialism. The colonialists in Africa occasionally paid lip service to women's education and emancipation, but objectively they were deteriorations in the status of women's owing to colonial rule. A realistic assessment of the role of women in independent pre-colonial Africa shows two contrasting but combined tendencies. In the first place, women were exploited by men through polyamorous arrangements designed to capture the labor power of women. As always, exploitation was accompanied by oppression, and there is evidence to the effect that women were sometimes treated like beasts of burden, as for instance in Muslim African societies. Nevertheless, there was a counter tendency to ensure a dignity of women to greater or lesser degree in all African societies. Mother right was a prevalent feature of African society. In particular, women held a variety of privilege based on the fact that they were the keys to inheritance. Hold on a second, everybody. I gotta do something real quick. More important still, some women had real power in the political sense, exercising there either through religion or directly within the political constitutional apparatus. In Mozambique, the widow of an Nubian king became the priestess in charge of the shrine set up in the burial place where her deceased husband and the reigning king had to consult her on all important matters. In a few instances, women are actually heads of state. Among the Lavudu and the Transvaal, the key figures was the reign queen, combining political and religious functions. The most frequently encountered role of importance played by women was that of queen mother or queen sister. In practice, that post was filled by a female of royal blood, who might be mother, sister, or aunt, or the reigning king in place such as Mali, Shanti, and Baganda. Her influence was considerable, and there were occasions when quote-unquote queen mother was the real power and the male king were mere puppets. What happened to African women under colonialism is that the social, religious, and constitutional and political privileges and rights disappeared, while the economic exploitation continued and was oft intensified. It was intensified because the division of labor according to sex was frequently disrupted. Traditionally, African men did the heavy labor and felling trees, clearing out buildings, houses, apart from conducting warfare and hunting. When they were required to leave their farms to seek employment, women remained behind, burdened with every task necessary for the survival of themselves, the children, and even the men, as far as foodstuffs were concerned. Moreover, since men entered the money sector more easily and in greater numbers than women, women's work became greatly inferior to that of men within the new value system of colonialism. Men's work was, quote, modern, and women's work was, quote, traditional and backwards, quote, unquote. Therefore, the deterioration in the status of African women was bound up with the consequent loss of the rights of indigenous standards of that work had merit and what did not. One of the most important manifestations of historical arrests and stagnations of colonial Africa is that which commonly goes under the title of tribalism, quote unquote. The term in its common journalistic settings is understood to mean that Africans have a basic loyalty to tribe rather than nation, and that each tribe still retains a fundamental hostility towards its neighboring tribes. The examples favored by the capitalist press and bourgeoisie scholarships are those of the Congo and Nigeria. Their accounts suggest that that Europeans tried to make a nation out of the Congolese and the Nigerian peoples, but they failed because the various tribes had their age-long hatred, and as soon as the colonial powers went, the natives returned to unaliving each other. To this phenomenon, Europeans often attach the words atavism. What is that? I'm gonna find out what this word is. I do that every single time too. Don't know why I do that. Why do I do that? What is this?
Atavism.
A tendency to revert to something ancient or ancestral. Okay. Carry the notions that Africans were returning to their own PS. Even the cursory survey survey of the African past shows that such assertions are the exact opposite of the truth. Oh, thank God. It is necessary to discuss briefly what comprised a tribe, a term that has been avoided in this analysis, partly because changing the page, it usually carries derogatory connotations, and partly because of the vagueness of those ways in which it employed in the literature of Africa. No, it was ATAVI. Yeah, ATAVISIM. ISISM. Yeah. Following the principles of family living, Africans were organized in groups which had common ancestors. Theoretically, the tribes was the largest group of people claiming descent from the common ancestors at some time in the remote past. Generally, such a group could therefore be said to be the same ethnic stock, and their language would have a great deal in common. Beyond that, members of a tribe were seldom all members of the same political unit, and very seldom indeed did they all share a common social purpose in terms of activities such as trade and warfare. Instead, African states were sometimes based entirely on part of the members of a given ethnic group, or even more usually on an amalgamation of members of different ethnic communities. An amalgamation. Yeah. All the large states of the 19th century Africa were, oh my gosh, here's another word. Hold on, I gotta do this other word. Sorry, everybody. Oh, it's multi-ethnic. And their expansion was continually making anything like quote-unquote tribal loyalty a thing of the past, substituting in its place national and class ties. However, in all parts of the world, that substitution of national and class ties for purely ethnic ones is the lengthy historical process. Variably there remains for long periods certain regional pockets of individuals who have their own narrow regional loyalties spring from ties of kinship, language, and culture. In Asia, the feudal states of Vietnam and Burma both achieved a considerable degree of national hegemony over the centuries before colonial rule. But there were pockets of quote-unquote tribes or minorities, quote-unquote, who remain outside the effective spheres of the nation state and the national economy and culture. In the first place, colonialism backed the further evolution of national solidarity because it destroyed the particular Asian and African states, which were the principal agents of achieving and liquidation of fragmented loyalties. In the second place, because ethnic and regional loyalties, which go under the name of quote-unquote tribalism, could not be effectively resolved by the colonial state. They tended to fester and grow an unhealthy form. Indeed, the colonial powers sometimes saw the value of stimulating the internal tribe jealousies so as to keep the colonized from dealing with their principal contradictions with the European overlords, i.e. the classical technique of divide and rule. Certainly the Belgians consciously fostered that. The racist whites in South Africa had by the 1950s worked out a careful plan to, quote, develop, end quote, the oppressed African populations as Zulu, as Xhosa, and as Sotho, so that the march towards border broader African national and class solidarities could be stopped and turned back. The civil war in Nigeria was generally regarded as having been a tribal affair. To accept such a contention would mean and extending the definition of tribe to cover Shell oil and Gulf oil. But quite apart from that, it must be pointed out that nowhere in the history of pre-colonial independent Nigeria can anyone point to the massacre of Abos and Hausa or any incidents which suggest that people up to the 19th century were fighting each other because of ethnic origins. Of course, there were wars, but they had no rational basis in trade, rivalry, religious contention, and clashes of political expansion. What came to be called tribalism at the beginning of the new epoch of the political independency of Nigeria was itself a product of the way that people were brought together under colonialism so as to be exploited. It was the product of administrative decisive device of entrenched regional separation of differential access by particular ethnic groups into a colonial economy and culture. Both Uganda and Kenya in East Africa were also situations in which a supposedly tribal factor continued to be preeminent. Sorry, buddy. There is no doubt that the existence of the Buganda kingdom within independent Uganda posed certain problems, but even after misapplying the definition of a tribe in Buganda, it still remains true that the Buganda problem was a colonial problem. It was created by the presence of the missionaries and the British, by the British Malawi, I don't know if I say that, land settlement in Uganda in the 1900s, and by the use of which Britain made the Buganda ruling class as, quote, sub-imperialist, end quote, within the colony of Uganda. Oh, my hand's hurting now. Stop hurting. In Kenya, the pattern of colonialism was different from that in Uganda because of the presence of white settlers. No African group was allowed any power and the capacity of NCOs for the colonial office, since the white settlers themselves filled the role. The white settlers took the best land and they tried to create a new world with African labor. However, the African community, which laid outside of the immediate white settler sector, was regulated along tribal lines. One of the numerous royal commissions of British colonialism published a report on Kenya in 1934. A contemporary Kenyan historian commented on the report as follows. My fucking thumb is hurting. The commission recommendation which, let me read that. The commission's recommendation which are accepted by the British government implies that Kenya was to be partitioned into two racial blocks, African and European. And in the African sector, all economic, social, and political development were to be conducted on tribal lines. Racialism thus became institutionalized. Human activity within small groups connected only by kinship relations, such as the tribe, is a very transient phase through which all continents passed in the phase of communalism. When it ceased to be transient and became institutionalized in Africa, it was because colonialism interrupted African development. Sorry. It was that I'm having a hard time. that for some reason, I can't say is when it's in front of that. That is what is implied in Mamim's reference to Africans being removed from history. Revolutionary African thinkers such as Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral expressed the same sentiment, somewhat differently, when they spoke of colonialism having made Africans into objects of history. Colonized Africans, like pre-colonial African chattel slaves, were pushed around into positions which suited Europeans' interests and which were damaging to the African continent and its people. In continuation, some further socioeconomic implications of that situation will be examined. Pre-colonial trade had started the trend of the disintegration. I can't say the damn word. I gotta hear it. Disintegration of the African economies and their technological impoverishment. Colonial rule sped up that trend. The story is often told that in order to make the telephone call from Accra to the British colony of Gold Coast in Abidjan, in the adjacent French colonial of Ivory Coast, it was necessary to be connected first with an operator from London and then with an operator in Paris who could offer a line in Abidjan. That was one reflection in the fact that the Gold Coast economy was integrated into the British economy and the Ivory Coast economy was integrated into the French economy, while the neighboring African colonies had little or no effective economic relations. The following calculations reached by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in 1959 goes directly to the point. The most outstanding characteristics of the transportation systems of Africa is the comparative isolation in which they have developed within the confines of individual countries and territories. This is reflected in the lack of links between countries and territories within the same geographical sub-regions. So they had to make long distance calls. That's fucked. Some African trades did persist across the colonial, let me see what time it is, 10 more minutes. Some African trades did persist across colonial boundaries. For instance, the centuries-old trade of kolo nuts and gold from the forest of West Africa to North Africa never completely ceased. Besides, new forms of African trade developed, notably with regard to supplying foodstuffs to towns or cash crop areas where there was insufficiencies of food. That kind of trade could be entirely within a colony, or it could cross colonial boundaries. However, the sum total of energy that went into expansion to inter-Africa trade was extremely small in comparison with the trade that was export-oriented. Since this inter-African trade did not bring benefits to Europeans, it was not encouraged by them, and up to the latter part of the colonial period, only 10% of Africa's trade was internal. It is also worth noting that Africa was denied the opportunities of developing healthy trade links with parts of the world other than Europe and North America. Some trade persisted across Indian Ocean, but on the whole, it was fair to say that the roads in Africa led to the seaports, and the sea lanes led to Western Europe and North America. That kind of lopsidedness is today part of the pattern of underdevelopment and dependency. Let me see where I'm going here. Hold on. One, two, three, four. All right, here we go. The damaging impact of capitalism on African technology is even more clearly measurable in the colonial period than in earlier centuries, in spite of the slave trade and of the import of European goods. Most African handicraft industries still had vitality validity. Oh my gosh. I'm having hard times with simple words. Hold on, everybody. It's an easy word, but I have to hear it. My brain won't let me.
Vitality.
I was right. Vitality. Okay. Let me see here. In spite of the slave trade and of the import of European goods, most African handicraft industries still had vitality at the start of the colonial period. They had undergone no technological advance, and they had not expanded, but they had survived. The mass production of the more recent phase of capitalism virtually obliterated African industries such as cloth, salt, soap, iron, and even pottery making. In North Africa, handicraft industries had made the greatest advances before colonialism in the spheres ranging from brasswork to woolens. As in the towns of feudal Europe, craft workshops flourished in Algerian towns like Oran, Constantine, Algiers, and Tlemcen. But French colonialism destroyed the handicraft industries and threw thousands out of work. The same thing had happened in Europe itself when new machines threw artisans out of employment in places like Lancashire and Lyons. But in that instance, the new machines became the basis of the prevailing mode of production. The formerly independent artisan returned to factories as proletarians to master different skills and expand the productive capacity of their society. In Africa, it was simply destruction without redress. By the time political independency was achieved, surviving craftsmanship had been turned towards attracting tourists rather than meeting the real needs of African people. Besides, as was true of European slave trade, the destruction of technology under colonialism must be related to the barriers raised in the path of African initiatives. The vast majority of Africans drawn into the colonial money economy were simply providing manual labor, which stimulated preparations rather than scientific initiatives. Africans connected to the trade sectors were sometimes successful in limited ways. The resourcefulness of West Africans market women is well known, but it was put to a pretty purposes. The problem posed to capitalists and the workers in Europe while making insecticide from African pyrethrum was one acquired that resourcefulness be expressed in a technical direction. But the problem posed to an African market woman by the necessity to make a penny more profit on every tin or import sardines was resolved was resolved sometimes by a little more vigor, sometimes by the touch of dishonesty, and sometimes by resort to juju. Okay. All right, I think I'm gonna stop there. My reading's starting to. So I'm gonna stop there before I go on. Oh my God, dude. No. They caused famines.
Page number?
281.
All right, so I wanted to talk about the fact that it was a lot of the African countries were matriarchies until colonization happened. And no, Mihal, that's Egypt. Have you ever heard of it? Had pharaohs, whole entire wonderful country, long before Europeans got there.
It was also noted that that also during the colonial epic that like men had to go when that came on, men had to go to the town centers in order to engage with the money market. So the women had to take had to again do everything in the household to help the children and other people. So like even during the colonial epics before that, they were put back into that scenario again because of colonialism and having to be able to engage with the money market of the town centers and the metropoles.
Mm-hmm. And then there was a lot of things about how the coasts, the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast, went to England and France.
Yeah, they were talking about how they're making a phone call, like to countries. You can tell that they were tied to the British colonial laws and the French colonial laws because in order to make a phone call, they had to call London first in order to engage with the family in the next country. And the same was the opposite, where they had to engage with the Paris in order to get a phone call into the other neighboring country.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
No.
All right. So this section was called navigate negative characters of political. Now, so they absolutely destroyed any type of economic development, and they didn't allow, when they came in to do those things, didn't allow for them to engage in any type of technological or economic development. The indigenous people weren't able to do those things because they gave it to either ethnic groups that are outside of Africa or to the actual colonialists, or they would create a comprador class that would engage with those things. What's up, Gabby?
Just wanted to hop on here. I really enjoy the reading, and again, just going over the origins of colonization. But sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Conrad.
That was it. That's why I said hi, Gabby.
But you were gonna say more stuff.
No.
Yes, you're allowed to say something else after that, and then I came up.
I'll just go.
No, that's pretty much it. I'm just here to just how the conversation flows. I was setting up my PC while also listening, so I was trying to multitask.
I don't know what else to drive this to. We went over a lot, and his book is almost over with. So we went over a lot.
Well, now that I have a second device, I can actually come to the readings.
Well, you do work throughout the week, right?
Well, yeah, but like not all the time.
Just 2 days.
Yeah, but like still.
Still. Yeah, true.
Still.
True. So it's just colonialism is the oh my gosh, deny of access to technology, the development of your society, and the development of like the workers. Instead, it displaces, takes over, destroys, and sets it up to serve the interests of the colonies. Because they even mentioned that how like roads and railways only go to the ports and nowhere else. Like there's no intra like trade or economies that connect with each other to do those things. The European countries in colonialism destroyed all those things because that country's only serving one direction. Instead of going into multiple different other directions in different other places, it serves just the colonial direction.
And the patriarchy being created in Africa as well. That was just fascinating to me learning about that.
Yeah. Anything else?
That's it.
All right. Well, Miss Teacup is away, so we'll just go. Bye, Miss Teacup.
Okay, bye.
Bye, Teacup. Comrade Teacup.